Welcome everybody to the Conscious Resistance Network. My name is Derrick. Today I'm excited to bring to you another interview looking at the global picture, the geopolitical picture, what's happening around our world, and how these individual conflicts and these proxy wars that we're seeing take place around the world being enforced through Western nations, NATO, of course the United States leading the way, and other nations right along with them. And today we're going to talk with journalist Brandon Turbeville about a number of topics relating to the geopolitical picture, and just to get us informed on what's happening with Russia, with ISIS, since there's so much propaganda out there, there's so much just this huge fear campaign that's continuing to go on about all these topics. So welcome to the show, Brandon. How are you doing?
Hey Derrick, thanks for having me on. I'm doing pretty good.
So let's go ahead and start with some recent news that just came out. And before we dive into it, I want to get into some background, of course. But recently a story broke, I think just a couple days ago, saying that, and I think this, for me, this is the latest of the fear campaign I was just discussing, saying that Boko Haram, who's of course the Islamist terror group based out of Nigeria, has apparently pledged allegiance to ISIS. And this is from a recording that was released that was supposed to be from Boko Haram's leader. And CNN, Fox, all the usual people are getting together and just pushing this as another reason why we need war against the Middle East and ISIS, and why people should continue to be afraid of terror. So your thoughts on that? First of all, give us some background on who Boko Haram is, the creation of this group, and how this ties into ISIS and the bigger global war on terror.
Sure. The Boko Haram group is another one of these jihadist terrorist organizations that just mysteriously popped up in around 2014 in the Nigeria region. There was also another branch of it that began popping up in Chad and Niger and Cameroon. All of these areas Boko Haram has a presence. But now in 2015 we see this massive military push on the part of Boko Haram in Nigeria, in the northeastern part of Nigeria. And what's interesting is that this group has gone from a relatively small, isolated, unknown group several years ago to a group that's actually able to mount military scale maneuvers and operations and actually capture territory from the Nigerian government. They not only have small arms, they've been seen with Humvees and armored personnel carriers. There's been very little information in the mainstream about where they actually got these, but they are there nonetheless. So I don't know if you want me to go ahead and jump into this connection with ISIS or not, but the recent reports are suggesting that ISIS has come out and, I'm sorry, Boko Haram has come out and pledged allegiance to ISIS as if this was big news, as this was something that we didn't expect, right? What people have probably been propagandized to believe is that Boko Haram and ISIS are largely different organizations, that they're not related in any way, that maybe they just look at each other from afar and size each other up. Well, back in 2014, ISIS was already publicly congratulating Boko Haram on its gains in Nigeria, on its military campaigns. So there was already a small connection there to begin with. But what I would encourage people to do is to look at the methods of Boko Haram, the ideology of the organization, the stated allegiance to ISIS, and the cui bono question, right? Who really is benefiting here? And I would also point out that it's clear that Boko Haram early on was connected to Al-Qaeda, right? So that's a very important part, because if anybody believes that the recent pledge of allegiance to ISIS is new, the fact that Boko Haram was connected to Al-Qaeda tells you that Boko Haram was connected to ISIS from the very beginning, because Al-Qaeda and ISIS are the same thing. Don't let the Western propaganda outlets fool you into believing that these are really separate organizations. The ISIS forces are nothing but a name change from something that was called the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant, which was a name change from the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, al-Nusra Nusra Front branches of al-Qaeda operating there in Syria and Iraq. They changed their names a couple of times, and ISIS was one of the manifestations of that name change. So if you're connected with al-Qaeda, you're connected with ISIS. If you're connected with al-Nusra, you're connected with ISIS, and so forth. So that's what these guys were, and that's what they are. They're connected with ISIS. And if you look at the implications of that, if they are essentially working with al-Qaeda, i.e. ISIS, then they are a branch of the Western intelligence created terrorist organizations. That's what al-Qaeda is, right? That's what ISIS is, and that is what Boko Haram is, created by Western intelligence. And look at the areas in which they're really focusing on. This is northeast Nigeria. So we got kind of the border areas with Chad, with northern Cameroon, with southeastern Niger. And this is a pretty strategic area. There's water issues there with the large freshwater areas, and of course there's the issue of geopolitical concerns with China. China has a relatively heavy presence in Nigeria. China recently, or last year, signed a deal to build a major railway project across Nigeria. They've been doing that in many places in Africa, but Nigeria was just one of them. And many of these railway projects are coming through the areas that Boko Haram is focused on. And of course, we know that Nigeria is chock full of oil, and they have a number of other natural resources there as well. There's iron, I believe. A lot of coal is located in Nigeria. A couple of other natural elements, natural resources that are plentiful in Nigeria, as well as the farmland, a lot of that fertile soil there. So this all has geopolitical overtones. And again, remember the French situation in Mali, where we saw terrorists overrunning areas in Mali that were largely coming from Algeria. We also have the Libyan al-Qaeda branches that are, that's just located just above Niger and Chad. So we're not far off from the same area as well. So all of these aspects of Boko Haram's involvement in Nigeria reeks of NATO Western involvement and terrorist proxies.
Yeah, you're right about that, Brandon. We're talking with Brandon Turbeville, journalist, about the claims that Boko Haram has joined up with ISIS and is now pledging allegiance to them. And of course, it's important to look at the background of these groups. Now, you mentioned Western NATO countries' involvement. You're not the only person to make this claim and to have done this research and come to similar conclusions. In late February, we had the president of Sudan make a statement claiming that ISIS and Boko Haram were created by the CIA and the Mossad. He was speaking to Euronews, and he said, "I said the CIA and the Mossad stand behind these organizations. There is no Muslim who would carry out such acts." He also warned against taking violence against these groups and stated that it would only elicit an even more violent response. And of course, these are similar statements that we heard from Lebanon's Hezbollah group and from the mayor of Ankara in Turkey. Your thoughts on those statements, and the fact that we have a president of another nation coming out and saying these things that many activists and freelance independent journalists have said for quite a while.
Yeah, and what's interesting now, the president of Sudan made these comments recently, but he's not the only leader to have pointed this out. I mean, Assad has pointed this out, as you said. The leader of Hezbollah has pointed this out. Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini had pointed this out as well. A number of other people have seen this openly in the works, and of course, the Western powers themselves have openly stated that they're arming these groups. Now, they might not come out and say that they're arming al-Qaeda. They'll come out and say that they're arming the Free Syrian Army, that they're arming Harakat Hazam, something like that. Or recently, actually, they have openly stated that they're going to arm al-Nusra. But the idea here is that Turkey in particular. The mayor of Ankara, it's funny that anybody in Turkey would have made these statements, because Turkey has played one of the most important roles in funding these terrorist organizations. And again, I would go back just to go really far back and point out that uh, Al-Qaeda itself was created in the late 1970s by the United States and British intelligence. So that's been continually used over the last few decades, and it hasn't stopped. So that's one aspect of proof there that the United States and NATO were funding these terrorist organizations. But also the Free Syrian Army, if you look at the so-called moderate rebels that were operating inside Syria, they were anything but moderates. In fact, we keep looking for a moderate rebel to be produced so we can analyze them and see what it looks like, but we have yet to actually see one. The Free Syrian Army was nothing but Al-Qaeda fanatics, right? These were terrorists who were brought about into this Free Syrian Army umbrella organization and labeled as moderates, but they were actually going around beheading people and torturing individuals, rapes, Sharia law, all of that stuff. There was no way to be able to tell the FSA from al-Nusra, from Harakat Hazam. There never was, and there never is, and there still isn't. So as far as the Israeli connection to terrorism, all you have to do is look and see the fact that Israel has acted as Al-Qaeda's air force on a number of occasions in Syria. We've seen instances where there have been forward movements of the terrorists coming across the Turkish border. They have been given air cover from the Israeli Air Force. We've seen Israel bombing Syria on a number of occasions in order to protect the death squads. We've seen Israel providing medical assistance to these death squad fighters. We even got a picture of Bibi Netanyahu shaking the hand of an injured Islamist in an Israeli hospital, and a number of other connections as well. Obviously, as I said, the United States has funded these organizations. They've been open about that for the last 4 years, supporting the so-called moderate rebels, which are actually jihadists, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and even the bombing campaign. The bombing campaign by the United States is nothing more than an attempt to destroy Syrian infrastructure. They're not bombing ISIS. They're bombing Syrian oil refineries. They're bombing grain silos. And of course, they've bombed Kobane, but that's not really anything to do with ISIS. That's more of a twofold purpose of herding death squads one direction or the other and forming a Kurdistan. But we also have, again, as I mentioned, Turkey, and Turkey has probably played after the United States, perhaps, or maybe even more than the United States in terms of the actual hands-on activity. Turkey has played one of the largest roles in this whole situation because they've acted not only as a limited training ground for terrorists, but they've acted as the funnel for terrorists to come through Turkish territory into Syrian territory. In fact, if you look at the map of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, and you see the areas where ISIS holds its territory, you can see the supply routes that come directly from Turkey down into Syria and then on into Iraq. And this is the basis of that caliphate, that area that spans Iraq and Syria that was captured by ISIS. This was directly a result of the supply routes coming from Turkey. So they played a major role. Even this recent invasion that Turkey has taken part in under the guise of protecting this tomb of Suleiman Shah, this is nothing more than a pretext. This is a pretext to act as an Air Force bombing campaign for ISIS. This is a false flag. It was discussed last year. There were leaked phone calls between Turkish officials that planned to use the threat of damage to the tomb, which is a Turkish exclave, use the threat of damage to that tomb as a pretext for invasion because it would have international support, because you could claim that the exclave was under threat from ISIS, and that would have a popular appeal. So all of that taken together, and we could go on and on and on all night to talking about Turkish connections to terrorism in Syria and Iraq.
Absolutely. So I'm looking at what you just kind of started to get into. There was your recent article that was featured on Activist Post called "Turkey's Invasion of Syria Shows Turkish Connection to ISIS NATO Agenda." And as you were saying, there's plenty of history of Turkey being involved in terrorism and supporting terrorists. And also, we have this false this false premise that they're selling this invasion under. Now, what do you think in the larger picture, though? Because in a moment we're going to talk a bit about the Russian situation and the situation in Ukraine, and we know we've got a number of developing issues here in the geopolitical landscape, from the supposed created whatever false terror from ISIS and from Boko Haram and various groups in from Nigeria to Libya, as you said, and then in Iraq and Afghanistan, all these various places. And most of the audience, I would say, is probably familiar with the plans of NATO, the global elite, the ruling class, however you want to label it, to take over that region for a number of reasons. But what do we see developing here? I mean, I hate to sound cliche, but I've seen this put out there where people are worrying about a new Cold War. Actually, I'm working on an article right now where we actually had a warning from Henry Kissinger just to the BBC in the last 2 days, where he put out like a 2 or 3 minute statement saying that we are moving closer to a new Cold War because of the United States' push towards conflict in Ukraine and their desire to fight with Russia. So we have all these situations going on. How does this latest situation with Turkey and Syria play into that bigger picture?
Well, it's one of many different battlefields on this grand chessboard, as Zbigniew Brzezinski would put it. Of course, you've got the Middle East. Syria is one of the last remnants of Russian influence in the Middle East after the fall of the Soviet Union. We've still got that port of Tartus forth there. You've got a potential for world conflict in a number of different places, and Ukraine is the most prominent, the most able to turn into something major quickly. But in the Middle East, you have this question, this attempt to destroy what they call the Shiite crescent, which goes from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq and then Iran, across parts of these countries. And it's this attempt to sort of stoke a multi-country regional war between Sunni forces, Shiite forces, this general chaos, and that could bring in a number of other major countries as well, like Russia and the United States, especially if you get Israel involved. In Ukraine, of course, you've got something more pressing. You've got an area where Russian forces and American forces or NATO forces could actually directly collide, not even as proxy forces, actual direct collision between the two nuclear powers, and that's very dangerous. There's other areas across the world as well. We have Eastern Europe, not just Ukraine, but other Eastern European countries. Georgia tends to be sort of an unstable place in terms of geopolitical possible color revolutions and that sort of thing. There's also other Balkan states and Baltic states as well that could play a major role. Of course, the Asian pivot, that's another area where these things could light up. We've got the Senkaku Islands of the dispute between Japan and China that could be potentially deadly for a lot of us. So this is really just the grand chessboard that Zbigniew Brzezinski discusses, and this is the potential for major conflict over these resources there.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen just this. I think it's been going. Obviously, we've had the Cold War, and for most of our lives, we've had less of Russian propaganda being consistent and more focus on the Middle East. But I think the past few years, and maybe even behind the scenes a bit longer than that, or maybe even the idea that the Cold War never really ended, and just these proxy wars have been their main method of continuing to fight each other rather than this open aggression as we had during the height of the Cold War. But it seems like the last couple of years there's been more and more of a push towards conflict with the United States and Russia, and we're going to get into Ukraine in just a moment. We're talking with journalist Brandon Turbeville. The next little piece of news that I would like for you to digest for us and give us your thoughts on as we get into Russia now are the recent murder of Russian Federation opposition activist Boris Nemtsov, and he was recently murdered right near the Kremlin, and shot, I think it was 4 or 5 times, and killed there. And just a couple of days ago, in the past couple of days, there's been some recent news. The first thing And I asked you about this. I'd like to get your thoughts on both of these topics and how legitimate you would think that they are based on your research. The first one is a letter that was supposedly the last letter written by him, and it was found by a close friend of his. She showed it to Reuters, reportedly, and the letter, which was a handwritten note, she said that he had passed her because he was afraid that they were being monitored where they were sitting and talking, so he didn't want to say it out loud, but basically said something to the effect that he had new information regarding his investigation into Russia's involvement in Ukraine and the claims that Moscow has been backing the separatist fighters in eastern Ukraine. And of course the letter couldn't be verified immediately, but there's that piece of information, and then also this report by the Russian authorities that they've found the two men that they claim are responsible for his murder, which they say is like a local police officer and someone else who apparently confessed to these crimes per usual. That the criminals came forward, and Putin's doing a great job. But your thoughts on these things?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of competing propaganda here, and one of the things I would say, in terms of this letter, this is really not something that we can confirm, right? This is a letter that we don't know for sure. We don't know this exists. We have this report from a friend of Nemtsov who says it exists, and that's all we can really go on. And of course, the Western media is going to jump on that at any opportunity they can to make this look like Putin was responsible, because that's the Western line, right? It would make you believe that Putin went out and strangled the guy with his bare hands. But on the other hand, the question of whether or not Russia is involved in Ukraine, well, we know Russia is involved in Ukraine. I would point out that the United States, that NATO started the whole issue in Ukraine when they funded the Euromaidan protest, but Russia is involved in Ukraine. And the Kremlin denies this. They say that no, they don't have any troops in Ukraine. They're not providing any weaponry to Ukraine, to the separatists. I should be clear, to the separatists in Ukraine. They deny it, but of course we know that governments do things and then they deny them, and that's what happens. There's been credible evidence that Russian soldiers are operating inside eastern Ukraine. There's also credible evidence. We've got documented video footage that American contractors and military personnel are operating in Ukraine as well. So again, this is what I referred to a second ago, where you have a situation where direct conflict, direct combat could take place between Russian and American forces, not just proxies. But back to Nemtsov, the question of whether or not suspects have been arrested that were guilty, who had actually killed Nemtsov. Yeah, well, we'll see about that. That's still not, that's certainly. I don't want to convict these people before they, for the information comes out. I will say that again, if Nemtsov was allegedly killed for this information, this is not new information. Again, this is information that's been out for some time. So I don't believe that Nemtsov was really killed for it. This is sort of the Snowden leaks idea, like what news? I don't see any actual things that we didn't know there. But the Nemtsov murder, I would caution anybody from believing that Nemtsov was a legitimate Russian opposition figure. Nemtsov was actually a part of this Western-backed color revolution apparatus. He had worked closely with the National Endowment for Democracy, with George Soros, with the CIA and USA, the State Department, and so forth. But before I really mention that in any detail, I would also want to point out that at this point, Vladimir Putin has the highest approval rating of virtually any Russian leader in modern history. That's pretty impressive. So the question would be, why did he need to kill Boris Nemtsov at this point? Who benefits from Nemtsov's death? There were protest marches scheduled for the date that was 2 days after Nemtsov's death. So this was already scheduled on the books, and he was supposed to be a leader in that march. The march, I guess, largely because of the high approval rating of the Russian government and of Putin specifically, it was not expected to turn out that many individuals, that many participants. But after Nemtsov's death, it was a shot in the arm to the movement, right? They expected a major swell of people after Nemtsov's death, after he could be used as a martyr. So you have to wonder who benefited more from that. Putin from the bad PR of killing an opponent who was actually a pretty unsuccessful one. Remember that Nemtsov was not a rock star opposition figure. Nemtsov was sort of this boring, ailing, lagging political figure that was kind of falling off the radar screen and was giving way to other opposition leaders like Khodorkovsky and not Kudrin, but Kasparov, who just had an atrocious article published in the Wall Street Journal. But who benefits more from this act? And that's clearly the NATO destabilization. If you look at the murder, which was that took place 2 days before the protest movement, again, that timing is very convenient, especially if you wanted to take out the leader of that protest movement. You certainly wouldn't want him to be a martyr before the actual movement he was supposed to lead. But that movement was called the Vesna Youth Movement. And Vesna in Russian is translated to mean spring. In other words, the spring youth movement, like the Arab Spring. This is, again, color revolution, Western-backed destabilization, manipulation here. And that's the Russian, is what we're seeing a creation of. So we can get spring and go into detail if you want, but essentially Nemtsov's connections were with American State Department individuals, the State Department directly, as well as ambassadors like Michael McFaul, who was proudly proclaiming his involvement in the 2004 Ukrainian Orange Revolution, where he talked about the role that the NED and the Freedom House and so forth played in that revolution. Nemtsov worked closely with him. Nemtsov also worked closely with Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was his advisor, but he was a member. He had attended a number of NED forums in the past involving the Russian society. We also have Kara-Murza being a co-founder of Solidarność with Nemtsov, and Solidarność is supposed to be this group, this umbrella group of Russian opposition. But again, this is the Western-supported Russian opposition. This is not legitimate Russian opposition. This is Western-backed, sort of IMF-backed. When you look at the reforms that Nemtsov wanted to bring about, he would refer to them as free market reforms, but these are IMF austerity, this is privatization schemes, this is all that kind of stuff. It's essentially World Bank dictates that he prattles about as being reforms. So this Nemtsov and Kara-Murza being the co-founders of Solidarność with Garry Kasparov, the other Western-backed oligarch and former, I think, poker player in Russia. So we've got those connections and connections with the organizations that Nemtsov tried to create, that like Young Russia, which has overtones of, again, destabilization organizations that go back to Mazzini many years ago. Nemtsov was connected to the Council on Foreign Relations, where he spoke in 2009. And again, the National Endowment for Democracy comes up repeatedly. So I go through all of this stuff to point out that Nemtsov was not a legitimate protest leader. This guy was totally bankrolled by the West, by money from Khodorkovsky, who was himself a Russian oligarch who prattles on about these reforms of the IMF and the World Bank and essentially Western banks, Wall Street, international banks, and that sort of thing. So not a legitimate Russian opposition force by any means.
Thank you. We're talking with Brandon Turbeville right now, journalist, discussing the geopolitical situation ranging from Boko Haram and ISIS and false terror groups like that are pushed by the Western NATO forces, and also looking in Syria, Turkey, and lastly, we've been discussing Russia and Ukraine. One question comes to mind, Brandon, for maybe some of the listeners who haven't been completely educated on these type of things. Can you define a color revolution for us?
Yeah, a color revolution is essentially a revolution that comes from the top down, not from the ground up, and it's controlled by forces that work inside of the I guess you could say government, but you'd also have to say a lot of these private organizations. In other words, it's a controlled revolution. It's using the force of the people to either overthrow a government and completely depose it and just kind of impose chaos and violence, or it's to impose to overthrow the president and impose a new president, a new regime. It could be used in a lot of different forms. It could be protest driven, it could be driven by violence, but essentially it's a controlled revolution that's controlled from the top down, controlled by non-governmental organizations and foundations and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Thank you for that definition. I appreciate your time, man. Anything you want to close out with? You've been giving us a lot of information to digest today. I'm going to have all the articles that we went over and the information in both the audio and video versions of this interview, and I really do appreciate it. But any last thoughts to leave us with in regards to this entire situation, and maybe what individuals can do to be prepared, more educated about these topics?
Yeah, first I would encourage people to look up the color revolution scheme, because this is going to be something that's important. We are not immune to that. This is something that can easily happen here. The Obama campaigns, especially of 2008, had elements of this color revolution apparatus, which is why you saw so many young people buying into this garbage of Obama. And you always had the slogans, the symbols, the clever music, the youth in the streets. This is something to look up, and I've done a number of articles on this, so people can just kind of Google my name with color revolution behind it, and maybe they can get a crash course in what this color revolution business is and what to look out for whenever they are encountered by it. And I just encourage people to not fall for the fear-mongering propaganda of ISIS under your beds, ISIS here, there, and everywhere, and that we're all going to be blown up by terrorists if the United States doesn't bomb another sovereign country, developed country, into the Stone Age. So please don't fall for that propaganda campaign. And again, you can go to my website, brandonturbeville.com, and peruse some of the stuff there. And as I said, hopefully get a crash course in this stuff.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brandon, for your time. And thank you guys for listening. This has been another interview on the Conscious Resistance Network. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and our SoundCloud. Follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. And I'll be back soon. Thank you to Brandon Turbeville. We'll talk to you guys soon.